When it comes to knowledge, vitamins, or hormones, it's not about how much you get, it's about how much you absorb.
Introducing the Paramena Bliss Podcast, a show dedicated to unraveling the mysteries of achieving optimal health naturally as you transition into perimenopause and menopause. Get ready to join your host, Dr. Seth Yates, an experienced naturopathic doctor, acupuncturist, and kinesiologist, as he shares his wealth of knowledge acquired from over 40,000 patient visits and 15 years in working with perimenopausal females. Welcome to the Paramena Bliss Podcast.
Hey, this is Doc Yates. Welcome to the Paramena Bliss Podcast, brought to you by PerimenalBliss.com. And today I want to talk about the different forms of hormones and the different ways that they can be used. This is not just for perimenopause. This is for menopause as well, because we're going to be talking about estrogen as well. So the biggest thing I would say for progesterone and estrogen is that never take oral estrogen. Any of the original studies that showed more problems when it came to side effects from hormones was from synthetic oral estrogens. But even with bioidentical, just don't take oral estrogens because of the way it's metabolized by the liver, which is a lot different than when it's used topically or vaginally. You want to only use them in those two forms, never oral, whereas progesterone, you can get away with that. So progesterone versus estrogen. Number one, when it comes to absorbing, progesterone versus estrogen. Now, the big thing, the difference between these two is the volume. Like when you're using progesterone, it's a much higher volume. So if you're putting them together, the progesterone is often absorbed better because it's absorbed easier because of there's so much more of it. Like we're dealing with, a milligram doses versus I'm not going to say gram doses, but yeah, we're dealing with 1 milligram versus 30. So 30 times the dose for progesterone to get that. So progesterone versus estrogen, ideally, in the vast majority of the cases, what I like to do is combine them all together into one for the first round, and the majority of the time, that works great. The levels come up for progesterone and estrogen. But sometimes, which is the second point, is that some people don't do as well with combinations. So you put together progesterone, estrogen, and the reason, again, I like to combine them, it just makes it a lot easier for clients. It makes it a lot more affordable for clients, and there's only one thing to remember, only one thing for them to purchase, and then they just put it on at one go and done. So I like to keep things simple because it helps people do it more consistently. Consistency is key. But sometimes when you test levels for the estrogen, it's always more with the estrogen. The progesterone is pretty straightforward when it comes to absorption. Estrogen seems to be a little bit more hit or miss because it's such a low volume. So when it comes to testing, it's oh, no, 1 milligram of estrogen wasn't cutting it. Their levels aren't coming up. So we go up to 1.25 or 1.5. And you can kind of gradually build your way up after each subsequent test for estrogen. But sometimes you just get to the point, you're you know what? We're going to separate them out, and now we're going to go estrogen only, and we'll have them do that in the morning, and progesterone only, we do that at night. So that is something that can affect people later if they don't seem to absorb them well together, and I've had to do that several times. The next point would be topical versus oral. This is only for progesterone, because as I mentioned earlier, we don't do oral estrogen. The big thing is, the difference is that when you're doing topical, you're doing a much lower dose. So 30 milligrams topical, which would be a fairly standard dose, so rubbing it on your forearm, whereas a fairly standard starting dose for oral progesterone could be 120 milligrams, so 4 times higher, but it's because the way it's broken down by the liver. So why would you ever want to use something if it's 4 times higher? One of the reasons is that progesterone helps with sleep, and some of the breakdown products of progesterone, when it's taken orally, broken down by the liver, it helps with sleep even more. So in those cases, people do well with oral progesterone. So people also do progesterone suppositories. That's not as common in menopause or perimenopause. You see that a lot more in fertility cases when they're trying to bring their levels up that way, especially, and have it drawn up directly into the uterus, blood supply of the uterus, because it helps with maintaining the fetus in the lining. But generally speaking, you're going to see topical or oral when it comes to progesterone, whereas estrogen will only be topical on the arm or vaginally. Which is the next point, topical versus vaginal. It's been proposed that when you're using low-dose estrogen and when you're using it vaginally, that it's only affecting just the vaginal wall and just the uterus. I find that very difficult to believe. Well, I would think that the majority of it would be taken up by those tissues since it's absorbed into the bloodstream of those tissues first. To say that it doesn't have any systemic effect, I feel that's way too much of a stretch. So just realize that it's, yes, the majority would be taken up there, but it's not the only place that it's taken up. Whereas when you're taking it topically on the arm, you're going for that full systemic approach. And it's not uncommon that you use both when it comes to estrogen. When you're trying to deal with systemic levels, you're using it on the forearm every day. Whereas if you're having just problems with a lot of vaginal dryness that goes along with perimenopause and menopause, then you're using it as a vaginal application generally every day for the first 2 weeks, but then after that, you're only using it twice a week. So the application and the dosing is different. This is a lot of random information, but for those of you who are wondering, why was it given this way or why was it done this way, this is going to help for those of you that are curious. And lastly, the base makes a difference. Cream versus gel. I find the cream base, depending on what you're mixing it in and depending on the person's skin type, some people absorb the cream fine. Some people, you have to use gel. I generally start with the creams. They're a lot more inexpensive. The gels are a lot more expensive. But for cases where they don't absorb through the skin very well with a cream, you have to use a gel. Now, I have seen it's very rare for the cream or the gel to cause reactions for people with sensitive skin. Though I would say maybe only once each, but I have seen people who've gotten a rash from both. So if one is causing the skin irritation, they generally can switch to the other form, and then that's fine. So that's something to keep in mind, is that if you're using something and you're like, oh, I can't use it anymore because it seems to have irritated my skin, just ask your prescriber if they can switch it from a cream to a gel or vice versa, and then you can find something that works for you. Because the last thing you want is someone who prescribed you estrogen to be like, oh, this is not working, so therefore we're going to give you oral. You need to avoid oral. And then as opposed to the other option, like, oh, it's not, this cream is irritating my skin, so therefore I'm just never going to use hormones ever, and I'm just going to be bottomed out forever. That has its own kind of line of consequences too. So I think it's better to just use a low dose long term. And I've had people kind of negotiate that with me, like, well, if this doesn't work, then I'm not going to do it at all. And I'm like, well, you're not negotiating with me because it doesn't matter to me, but for your own benefit long term, having zero hormones definitely has a lot of negative effects. So it'd be better in terms of thinking, am I just going to give up on this, or am I going to look for an alternative solution so I can get the results I'm looking for? So if you had any questions about how hormones are absorbed, what kind of formats and dosing to use, I hope this was helpful. It's not as, it's a little bit more specific for people that may be already using it or wondering about how they would use it. So I hope this was helpful. This is Doc Yates signing off.
Thank you for tuning in to the Paramena Bliss podcast. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and visit paramenobliss.com for more valuable information on how you can thrive during your transition through perimenopause. Join our community of like-minded women who are dedicated to achieving optimal health naturally, and stay up to date with the latest tips, tricks, and advice from Dr. Seth Yates. And we'll catch you on the next episode of the Paramena Bliss podcast.